Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 23rd of October of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with the northern direction with the area in the vicinity of Kharkiv. The Russian sources reported that Ukrainians started destroying the bridges that located on the borderlines between Belgorod region of Russian Federation and Kharkiv area. And the main reason of that is that Ukrainians are no longer planning and going to make any special operations on the borders. They understand that because of complete absence of military help from the Western countries, the Ukrainians are no longer able to make special operations, and the only thing they can do is to be in a very big defense state. So that's why they're destroying the bridges, and the purpose of these actions is to slow down the Russians if the Russians ever are going to start the Russian offensive operation in Kharkiv region. Now we are moving to Kupiansk direction. The Minister of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost around 195 soldiers, 6 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems. On this video, for example, we can see how the Russians, somewhere in the vicinity of Liman I, launched a drone, and as a result of FPV drone strike, the Russians managed to damage Ukrainian command center and I position. So basically the Russian drone was launched somewhere from this area and the strike took place somewhere in this area, so 2.38 kilometers. Very big distance. We understand that there are fields between Russian and Ukrainian positions. Probably the Russian forces located much closer because, as I understand, the Russians are not moving along the fields. They continue their offensive operation along the forest, and the main purpose of the Russians is to get the edge positions of the city. Yet we haven't received any confirmations of any clashes on the ground in direction of Sinkovka. A lot of updates are coming from the Ivanovka, Yahidna area, Orlyanka. We discussed this situation in the previous video. The Russians managed to establish control over the edge positions in front of Ivanovka, and maybe currently, right now, the Russians are storming the city, and these updates we're going to receive tomorrow. Anyway, the Russians have completely prepared themselves before very powerful attack in this direction. One more time, as a result of clashes, the Ukrainians lost significantly very high number of losses, 195 soldiers. Now we are moving to Liman direction, and we got also a lot of updates from this territory. And the most important thing that, according to the report of Ministry of Defense, the Ukrainians lost 480 soldiers on this direction. So basically, this is the highest level of losses of the Ukrainian forces since the beginning of the special military operation when talking about this direction. It's a very important question, what exactly did happen today, that not today but during the previous 24 hours that Ukrainians had such a heavy level of losses. Obviously there are very heavy clashes on Tarskoye salient, and the most important clashes are taking place on the line between Makiivka and Plasyanka, which this area the Russians are trying to penetrate almost every single day, but for now there were no progress in the Russian offensives. Also a lot of updates are coming from Siversk direction. Today, some Russian sources, at least 2 independent Russian sources, reported that as a result of an expected counter-offensive operation or offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish control over Vasyukovka. Vasyukovka is the village that located on the north of Solidar, on the west of Mykolaievka, and on the south of Siversk. Basically, Vasyukovka is the base of any offensive operation in direction of Siversk and Liman, let's say Slaviansk and Seversky Donetsk River. Of course, Vasyukovka is a very long village, and there are at least 3 bridges that split this territory in many parts. As I understand, the Russians haven't managed to establish control over entire village because, one more time, the village is very long. The village started somewhere in the vicinity of Sako-Ivantseti, then it goes through the river, and then it goes right almost to the village by the name of Khromovka. I don't think that the Russians managed to establish full control over this area, but as I understand, the Russians managed to repeat the same story in Vasyukovka as they managed to implement in Orekhovo-Vasilivka. If you remember, months ago, the Russians already reported that they managed to capture Orekhovo-Vasilivka, but later, and yet we haven't received even a single video confirmation that the Russians managed to bypass at least half of the village. Maybe the Russians managed to enter the edge positions, and I suppose that the Russians made the same thing in Vasyukovka. As you can see, Vasyukovka is split in 2 parts, the western and the eastern, and there is a bridge. So as I understand, the Russians managed to establish fire control or even destroy the bridge. They managed to establish some operational encirclement by taking every single road under fire control, and maybe as a result of an unexpected offensive operation, the Russians managed to get and to capture this territory, but not the entire Vasikovka. Anyway, this is a very interesting piece of news. We're going to follow these updates to understand what exactly is going on this direction and what the Russians are planning to do next. Because from this bridge chat, I don't see any attempts to continue offensive in direction of Siversk, because there are rivers, there are still a lot of things to do, but by taking this foothold, if the Russians manage to capture this territory, anyway, they managed to secure the northern flank of Solidar, and now the Ukrainians basically need to start from the very beginning. They need to cross the river, they need to cross the bridge, they need to cross the river from the north, and with this configuration of the front line, the Russians managed to secure the northern flank for 100%. Anyway, it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to attack this area, and it also reduced the Ukrainian possibilities. And one more time, this might be a possible base for further offensive operation in direction of Siversk, because if the Russians want to attack, let's say, Razdolovka, Fedorovka from the south, like from Saka-Ivanseti to the Fedorovka, from Krasnopopovka, Mykolаevka, Razdolovka, first of all, the Russians need to be 100% sure that the flanks are secured. And maybe this is a part of securing operation, so we'll see anyway within a day or within a week. If the Russians are planning to do something, obviously we're going to see more updates from this territory. And as I understand, the Siversk direction also was included into the numbers of Liman, 480 soldiers, because the level of losses is too heavy. Now we're moving to Donetsk direction. The Russians and the Ukrainians continue clashes on the area between Klishchiivka and Avdiivka. The Russians launched a few reconnaissance in force and reconnaissance in combat operations in direction of the railways, and as a result of those attacks, the Ukrainians had some losses, but we haven't received any updates whether the Ukrainians left this territory or not, so we will keep this area in the gray zone. When talking about the southern direction, the Ukrainians continue bombing and attacking the Russian forces, the concentration of Russian artillery, ammo depots, manpower and tanks and so on. And this area, I'm trying to prepare this territory, prepare this sector for possible upcoming Ukrainian counteroffensive operation. This is very important for the Ukrainians before winter comes, to force the Russians to cross the railways and to establish control over every single village, city and settlement that located on the left side of the railways that goes from Bakhmut to Kurdyumovka and to this Zelenopolye. Yet the Ukrainians haven't managed to do this, and there are still at least two villages on the Ukrainian side, Azaryanovka and Kurdyumovka. When talking about Avdiivka direction, we got a lot of updates from this territory. Finally, we start receiving some geolocations from the Russian side on the northern direction. During the previous days, we had a lot of updates from the southern direction. The Russians established full fire control, full FPV drone control over the southern area. The Russians published a lot of videos how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of Tsarskaya Khota fortifications, in the vicinity of the bridges, and on the south of Ninth Quarter, and many other positions of Ukrainian forces were attacked and damaged by the Russians' FPV drones. But we haven't received any updates regarding any attempts to attack further to the north. Basically, the Russians are at stage of preparing this territory by attacking every single shelter with FPV drone. When talking about northern direction, there are still very heavy clashes, but currently this is the first day since the beginning of the Russian offensive operation that was launched on the 10th of October when we start receiving positive videos from the Russian side. The first positive video we got took place in the vicinity of this landfill of Terikon, and this is the most interesting video probably of the day. On this video you can see how the Russians helicopters were flying above the railways and were attacking the Ukrainian forces. And this is very interesting because imagine yourself the level of offensive operation, the level of, let's say, electronic warfare suppression, the level of artillery strikes, and the level of control over the territory with artillery systems, that the Russians were able to fly right above the territory of Ukrainian forces with helicopters. So it was crazy operation. The Russians probably were supporting the ground forces like infantry and troopers in their storming attempts in direction of Orlovka, Stepova, Berdychi. We don't know the results of that operation, but those helicopters above the railways is very interesting. Furthermore, based on the angle of the video and angle of direction of this video, as I understand, that video was made from the Terikon, from this landfill. So this is not 100% confirmations that the Russians managed to establish control over these territories, but at least currently there are more chances that the Russians control this territory, but not the Ukrainians. So this is the first positive update from this territory. Another important update is coming from the northern direction. Today the Ukrainians published a very interesting video of a very large line group of Russian soldiers who were heading in direction of Krasnogorovka. According to this video, you can see that the Russians were moving from the north to the south, not from the Krasnogorovka outside the city village, but inside the village. And according to geolocation, the Russian soldiers, the photo of Russian soldiers was made in this area, and the Russians were moving along this line, so to the south. Let's use with arrows, it will give a better understanding. So that was the Russian movement. So they were moving a very big group of Russian soldiers, and the question is where exactly the Russians were. So they were moving from the north to the south. Later during the day we got another geolocation, another video, how the Russian soldiers, a very big and large group of Russian soldiers, were storming the Ukrainian trenches. This video is not geolocated. I added this video softly. It's very difficult to understand where exactly these events took place, but on this video we see that a significant number of Russian soldiers, at least on this video we can calculate up to 10 soldiers, were storming the Ukrainian trenches and were clearing them. And as a result of that operation, the Russians managed to establish another fortification of the Ukrainian forces on the Avdiivka direction. So as I understand, if the Russians were moving from the north, there are three possible areas, and according to this video, as I understand, these are stormtroopers. So they were returning back after some successful operation. So based on this video, we can make a conclusion that the Russians could return from three directions. The first one is the area along the railways that located right on the north of Krasnogorovka. But this territory was captured a long time ago, so as I understand, this is not the case. Another area that that the Russians came from is the area also, let's say, right on the south of the railways. Maybe the Russians on that video were storming this territory, and maybe the Russians captured this tree line, but the thing is that later, right before I start making this video, I haven't added that icon on the map. The Ukrainian sources reported that they lost a very powerful and a very important position on the northern flank of Krasnogorovka. So as I understand, as a result of those attacks, the result of storming the trenches, the Russians managed to establish control over these forest tree lines. So maybe this area was captured. Currently, I don't have 100% proofs to give you 100% information, but something tells me that those clashes and the Russians managed to capture exactly this position. If it's true, then and if the Russians are able to dig in deeper in this area, it will allow the Russians to create a very stable flank position on the north, which will secure the Russian forces who will try to continue offensive operation in the direction of Stepova, who will try to cross the railways and to capture this small village. Without securing the northern flank, this operation is impossible. But now, as I understand, the Russians managed to complete this securing. Furthermore, the Ukrainians also published a video how they were attacking and destroying Russian tanks, and this video is geolocated and on this video you can see that most of the tanks are located very close exactly to these tree lines, exactly to this area. So as I understand, all these events are connected to each other. First, the Russians sent significant number of armored vehicles in direction of these tree lines. Those armored vehicles, most of them were destroyed on the minefields as a result of counter-artillery duels, as a result of mortar attacks and so on. But the Russians managed to land the infantry, and basically the Russian infantry first captured the east tree line, and from this tree line the Russians started movement to the north, and during the day the Russians were clearing this area, and after finishing this operation successfully, they returned back to Krasnogorovka, and we saw the video of the movement of Russian forces heading back to the city, to, let's say, to the main base. So probably this is exactly the events that took place on the northern flank. Anyway, the Russians are moving every single day with very heavy losses. Of course, they're taking more and more square meters, also helicopters flying above the territory of Ukraine. Everything tells me that the situation for the Ukrainians is not critical, but is already probably done. The situation is done for the Ukrainians on the northern flank. It is just a question of time when exactly we're going to start receiving updates about the fall of Stepovo, Berdicho, or even chemical plant. I expect these events is going to start happening very, very soon. We haven't received nothing from Pervomaiska, and probably the third or fourth day in a row we stopped receiving any updates from Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka. After the Russians were a little bit defeated on this area, they start regrouping and creating another plan of offensive operation to the north, to Novomikhailivka. But I'm telling you that there are no chances to storm Novomikhailivka successfully without the second attack from the northern direction, from Zverinets fortification. And as I understand, the Russians haven't managed to clear the fields, so that's why the northern operation is not ready. When talking about South Donetsk direction, the Russians reported that as a result of artillery duels, heavy clashes, fierce battles in this area, the Ukrainians lost 160 soldiers and 3 armored vehicles. So the level of losses is heavy for this front line. When talking about Zaporozhye area, the Russians continue bombing and attacking the concentration of Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainians, without counting the losses in the manpower, continue sending more and more infantry to Verbova without any progress, without any success, without nothing. People are dying without getting any results, and the Russians reported that as a result of clashes on Zaporozhye area during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians lost 80 soldiers. So the level of loss is very heavy. I have calculated the total number of Ukrainian losses during the previous 24 hours, and just during this period of time, the Ukrainians lost 1,170 soldiers. More than 2 battalions were destroyed. And the main losses took place in Liman direction. Something big is happening. But neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians are publishing anything about this. Probably because yet neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians know exactly who is winning, because the clashes are very bloody and the clashes are very difficult. The Russians started, when talking about Rabotina-Verbova fields, the Russians started restoring their positions not just by the counteroffensives. The Russians brought another squad of another group of distance mining method equipment, and they started their dirty job from the beginning. Currently, this area, the Russians started mining this area heavily, and this is something like restoring of Russian control and power over these fields. I think that maybe even before winter comes or New Year comes, the Ukrainians will be forced to step back from these fields. Now we are moving to a final interesting direction, to Kherson area. The Russians continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian forces all over the bank of the river, Dnieper River. On this video we can see how the Russians managed to discover the Ukrainian position, artillery position. There were some cars with probably equipment, maybe for FPV drones or something like this. And as a result of Lancet strike, the Russians managed to destroy at least one artillery system. Furthermore, the Russians continue bombing the Ukrainian positions in the city like Olgovka. On this video we can see the usage of FAB-500, and Mykolaievka, the same story, FAB-500 against the city. And the reason of that is that Ukrainians continue sending more and more forces on the Russian bank of the river in the vicinity of Krynki. This morning we got update that Ukrainians have already established 2 footholds in this area among the islands and the area where they have some concentration of forces. Very difficult to understand the number of these forces, but obviously there are more, up to 100 soldiers in 2 red squares, and the Ukrainians use these 2 red squares. Let's add them, let's say, on map, these 2 territories like operational reserves. every single these squares have around 100 soldiers. So basically up to 200 soldiers the Ukrainians have just on the islands, and up to 20-30 soldiers the Ukrainians have in the city by the name of Krynki. And they're using these both two operational areas of reserves to send more forces, to make rotations, to bring some supply. And also the Ukrainians use the cities like Novotyagинka, like Lvova, Ivanovka, Tyaginka to send reserves in this direction. So this is like the Ukrainian tactics. So they're using reserves here, and then there's some kind of configuration of everything, and then everything that survives goes further to Krynki. So this is the Ukrainian tactics in this area. Yet the Russians haven't managed to force the Ukrainians to step back from this foothold. We have also updated the map in the vicinity of Podstepnaya. As we discussed, the Ukrainians somehow managed to penetrate the Russians' defense belt to capture a few trenches, and after that the Russians started bombing and attacking the Ukrainians with FPV drones, which confirms the Ukrainian control over this territory, that the Ukrainians created another foothold. So if the situation will continue the same way, we will keep this area as a yellow, we will color this territory in yellow, and this is another foothold on the strong land of that is under Russian control. At least at two places the Ukrainians have some progress. As you can see, when talking about the global scope, the Ukrainians are trying to attack Kazachyi Lahiri at least from two sides. This is the first side and this is the second one. So the main goal of the Ukrainians is to establish probably something like this. But I'm not sure that the Ukrainians are able to do this, but at least they can try. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of artillery duels, bombardments, clashes in this area, the Ukrainians lost 90 soldiers, 3 armored vehicles. The level of losses is very heavy, and we understand that currently the losses, Ukrainian losses, is not just as a result of like air bombings, but also as the clashes on the ground, on the territory of Russian Kherson region. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel. Put your likes to my Patreon. And have a good day. Bye bye.